This week's message is taken from Isaiah chapter 6, verses 1 through 8. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne, high and lofty, and the hem of his robe filled the temple. Seraphs were in attendance above him. Each had 6 wings. With 2 they covered their faces, with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they flew. And one called out to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. The pivots on the threshold shook at the voices of those who called, and the house was filled with smoke. And I said, Woe is me, I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips. Yet my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Then one of the seraphs flew to me, holding a live coal that had been taken from the altar with a pair of tongs. The seraph touched my mouth with it and said, Now that this has touched your lips, your guilt has departed and your sin is blotted out. Then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, Whom shall I send, and who will go for us? And I said, Here am I, send me. May God bless the reading of his holy word. Up until February, and even into the beginning of March of this year, millions of people gathered together for the purpose of worshiping God every Sunday. They'd come to all kinds of churches, big churches and small churches, city churches, country churches. Some would meet in multi-million-dollar sanctuaries. Some would meet in rented facilities. Some had loud worship services. Some preferred a quiet, contemplative atmosphere. Some churches sang only traditional hymns. Others sang contemporary worship choruses with rock bands. Some preachers wore robes, others didn't. I could go on listing the differences and the different types of worship to which folks have become accustomed. Since March, there have been an unbelievable and remarkable assortment of new types of worship. Zoom worship, drive-up worship, with parishioners pulling into a church parking lot and worshiping like they were in some sort of old-fashioned drive-in. Streaming worship, where the services were streamed on the internet. Recorded YouTube worship, and who knows how many other types of distance worship methods. Millions and millions of people worshiping in uncountably different ways. All of these millions of worshipers fall into 2 categories: those who connect with God and those who simply go through the motions. With some exceptions, most of those in category 2 really want to be in category 1. Why else would they be in church? But for reasons that are beyond them, there are obstacles in their way. Especially lately. Maybe the recorded message, the worship, is too short. Maybe it's too hard to understand. Maybe it doesn't feel like worship if it doesn't have singing or organ music, or if it isn't in the sanctuary. Maybe it's just too hard to interface with a screen. Maybe the preaching is bad, or the connection is bad, or the person's phone is just too small. Maybe the problems aren't external, but instead in our own hearts. Maybe it's doubt or confusion, boredom, or other kinds of distance and separation from God, some sin, or maybe some simple distraction. Whatever the reason, there are many people involved in church hoping to get something out of it, but just don't. Instead, week after week, worship ends leaving them feeling empty and bored. Amazingly, in the same service, there may be many who go to experience exhilaration, knowing that they have been in the presence of God, and others are just not satisfied. One pastor in a church once experienced something after a Sunday worship service. One was a comment from a new member who said enthusiastically, "This is one of the greatest worship services I've ever had." Moments later, another member approached and snapped, "The organ absolutely ruined worship for me this morning." And both of those people had been in the same worship service and were speaking honestly. The most important element in any worship service, however, is the heart of the person attending the service. If your heart is bent towards God when you walk in the door, it will be full of God when you're done. Jesus said those who worship God must worship in spirit and in truth. Worship can be defined as getting drenched with God. And many do get wet when they're in worship. They're drenched. They feel it. They experience it. They become a part of worship and are filled with the glory of God. And many are instead filled with hunger, as halfway through the experience, they're looking forward to lunch afterwards. They're simply glad, perhaps, that it's over. That long hymn, ugh. Which of the two groups are you in? This passage from the Old Testament book of Isaiah that I just read from shows what it was like for one moment, for one man that would become a prophet. Isaiah recognized God as he entered the temple. He was overcome with an awareness of God's majesty. He says, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne high and lofty. His greatness and the hem of his robe filled the temple. His supremacy, angels were in attendance over him. His holiness, holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts, he heard them singing. God's glory. The whole earth, he says, is full of its glory, the seraphs say. And he recognizes it. He sees it. There's a lot going on during that moment when Isaiah enters the temple. Things that I've never really experienced in worship. Angels flying around, a sanctuary full of smoke, the whole building shaking and rumbling, and finally God himself sitting on a throne. And yet Isaiah is ready to see these things, and his heart is humbled by the experience. He doesn't dash from the room afraid. He's not shocked and useless from the experience. He doesn't experience the moment as an exciting, thrilling show, like a fireworks display. In fact, he reflects on the nature of his own heart and soul before God. He knows he was entering into God's presence. Maybe he was a little apprehensive. And when he comes into connection with God, into God's presence, he comes into contact with his own sinfulness, his own unworthiness. By the end of the service, he's healed. Worship is about the nature of our own hearts, about the condition of our own soul. If each one of us is well prepared, if each one of us has created in our hearts the right atmosphere for worship and the meeting with God, then the experience isn't about the details. It's about how we relate and connect with God. Worship begins with the right attitude about God. As far as is humanly possible, we must see him as he really is, powerful, holy, pure, good. And seeing God's this way prepares our hearts for what God has in store for us, for true worship. Next week, or perhaps sometime in the next month, or around, or soon thereafter, perhaps, we will very likely be starting up worship services again in our own sanctuary. Worship will once again be very different from what we normally enjoy. Worship will probably have some elements of social distancing, maybe with folks in every other pew and one household per pew, maybe wearing face coverings, maybe requiring hand sanitizing. probably not having hymns out of a hymn book or even sung for all of us to sing together. No passing offering plates, no bulletins, no coffee hour, no communion for now. Maybe even a limit for how many people can come into the sanctuary. What will that be like? Will we yearn for the days of worshiping in front of our computer, in our bathrobe, in our own home? Will we miss hymn singing and shaking hands and exchanging hugs and coffee hour? Or will we be enraptured with being back in the sanctuary, hearing the beautiful hymns on our organ once again? Our common experience together can be altered and tweaked to accommodate social distancing or personal preference, with guitars, with strobe lights, with all kinds of different things. But who knows what it will look like someday? Perhaps soon enough we'll be able to incorporate all of our favorite modes and methods of worship again. And yet, most important, the element of worship that is most vital isn't this little detail or that little innovation or tradition or outlandish new thing or custom or practice. Let me say it again. The most important element in any worship service is the heart of the person worshiping. Are you expecting to see God, to meet God in worship, or not? If I'm not the worshiping type, I don't like this God thing and I never have, then maybe it will always be more boring and meaningless for me. Maybe a dance ministry and fireworks and strobe lights during worship and skits and plays and killer music program will all still bore the daylights out of me because I don't connect with the core of worship no matter what happens. But if I'm ready for worship and I yearn for connection, then I can worship at home or in the sanctuary, arm in arm with my friends and family, or perhaps in the same sanctuary as I grew up in, only at arm's length. I can worship in the quiet of my own solitude or in a packed and echoing cathedral, shaking with the sounds of thousands singing. As we prepare to come together again, we will once again be challenged. It has been a very challenging year. I pray that our hearts and our minds will be ready to meet God, whatever the conditions, whoever is there, and in the presence of the rest of the body of Christ, as we all gather together to meet God, to become one. Amen.